So I, more like for another 20, 30 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So this map number 7, the 12 states of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1967 to 1975. So now, it's now 12 states from initially 13 regions, and at some point 14. The states are reflecting ethno-regional and communal distinctions. These states came immediately after the Nigerian-Biafran War that most of you out there, I'm sure you've heard about. That war was particularly devastating. We don't quite know the number, how many people were, not necessarily just killed as a consequence of that war. Most of them actually lost their life as a result of starvation. Still the most brutal civil war in African history, in post-colonial African history, from 1967 to 1970. The commemoration of the 50th commemoration of that war is this year. And for those of you who are following African news, and particularly Nigerian news, there's now a new Neo-Biafran movement, which is serving as a major destabilizing force to the country. I feel I need to say a few things about this Neo-Biafran movement. Now I want to say this in the context of the elephant in the room, which I haven't said anything about, is really this idea of Islamic insurgency. I did mention to you that I hope we'll have more discussion on that during Q&A. I don't want that to be the main focus of the formal aspect of the talk. And within that context, perhaps say a couple of things about Boko Haram. What I want to say about Boko Haram first is that because of the nature of Nigerian society that I talked about, I've mentioned that it's important for us to appreciate the context in which the Nigerian state and society has been formed and forged over time. So I think it's important for us to have that at the back of our mind. And I would hope that in the ways in which you think about your own pedagogy and your own curriculum and your own work, I know fully well that our regions are all very different. But if there's anything that my own work can contribute to all the exciting perspectives you have in anti-Semitism, I hope will be this kind of historicity that I'm talking about. The ways in which structures matter a great deal, and the ways in which the moment in history should provide us with a lens to look backwards and really better contextualize so that we're not really caught just in the moment. And we make in other words, we make what is popular in the moment the essence of our thesis, of our argument, or rather argumentation, and stop there. I am not suggesting in any way that what is happening now is not crucial. It is crucial, but I want us really to use this as an opportunity to dig deeper. So, in the context of post-colonial Nigeria, what is important, I want to suggest, is the ways in which we bring in that pre-colonial. That pre-colonial that I spoke about before the break. Those pre-colonial structures and practices, religious and otherwise, if you recall the dialectic between tradition and modernity that I alluded to. And to say that these structures are just incredibly resilient. And they're resilient not because they're necessarily reactionary. They're resilient because they're in fact incredibly resourceful. They're extremely flexible, they're very adaptive, they're really malleable. Their resiliency lies in their flexibility, in their malleability. And I want to suggest to us that even when we engage subjects and questions that are really problematic, like a Boko Haram, which, as you know, is a Salafi or Neo-Salafi movement within the discourse of religious violence and extremism in northern Nigeria, and by extension in Nigeria with its clear destabilizing force. Boko Haram is clearly one of the most vicious, if not the most vicious Islamist terrorist organization in the world. Its capacity to do harm is mind-boggling. It really is. You know that, you have that information because they're all over major newspapers, they're in the news on a regular basis. But as we grapple with the enormity of this massive human tragedy, Boko Haram has essentially displaced millions of Nigerians in northeastern Nigeria, ordinary people in Yobe. Nigeria, as you know, is a federation. In Yobe, in Adamawa, and in Borno, just very much in this part. So this is really where Boko Haram operates, so all through this region. But it's really very important for us to appreciate, and this doesn't come across in the news, to really begin to engage the history of Boko Haram, right? The short history of Boko Haram. But not just simply the short history of Boko Haram, but to understand that short history of Boko Haram within the deeper, long history of what we might just simply generally refer to as Islamist reformist movements and extremism in northern Nigeria. So we start with the first premise, that the tendency for extreme reformists, because they see themselves as a reformist. Reformist here is not what you and I would consider to be a reformist. Reformist here is really what you and I will consider to be looking backwards. But in their mind, they're looking forward, if you see what I mean. You're saying, because what they're engaging, I mean, consider this for instance. They're engaging scriptural text in a very serious way. They're not necessarily all good Muslim clerics, good scholars. As a matter of fact, most of them are bad scholars. But they're convinced in their own mind they're good scholars. Because they've taken the time to read quite extensively the Quran and the Hadith. They've done their homework that way. So in doing that homework, they also know intentionally the society where they live very well. Because they're products of that society. They're not just simply people who became terrorists one day, as most of us would like them to believe. So yes, now the strand is Salafi, or New Salafi, or Salafia. They have connections to the Gulf region. In the case of Nigeria, the great northern Nigerian Muslim cleric, arguably the most brilliant in all of Africa south of the Sahara, is a guy by the name of, he's since passed on in the early 1990s, Abubakar Gumi, G-U-M-I, a really brilliant Muslim cleric who easily would be one of the most remarkable Islamic thinkers of his generation, not just simply in Nigeria, but beyond. Won all kinds of awards in Saudi Arabia and brought Nigeria close to Saudi Arabia. In so many ways, he converted from being Qadariya, right? So as I mentioned to you, the dominant Muslim tradition in northern Nigeria is essentially Qadariya and Tijaniya. And he became Salafi. No, Salafi here now provides a major critique of Sufism, right? So the first thing we need to understand, and these questions are not just simply relevant in the case of Nigeria, they're also relevant in the ways in which you engage questions and discourses of Islamicism in other parts of the so-called Muslim world. And I don't buy this idea, by the way, of a central core Muslim world and a peripheral Muslim world. I think they do exist, don't get me wrong. They do exist analytically, but they exist in the mind. Because in actual fact, when you look at the literature and when you look at the primary data, what you do see is that they don't see themselves as core and peripheral. They see themselves as really part of an integral Muslim world, and they act that way. They vote literally with their feet. This is not to suggest that there are no notions of ambivalence between them. So in other words, we can reify the Arab world as much as we want, right, as the core, and it is. But in actual fact, it's as much as though we feel that some people are marginal Muslims because they're somewhere in West Africa or East Africa. No, because guess what? They're having constant transactions with the wider Muslim world on a regular basis. And it's not just simply doing the Hajj. If you see what I mean, it's actually engaging in the scholarship, in the literature, in the debates, coming out of different parts of the Muslim world in a very intentional way. So we need to be mindful of those kinds of questions. We need to be very careful about the formulations that have come to, in so many ways, actually shaped the ways in which Muslim studies have been, in a way, being shaped as a Western discourse. So now, Boko Haram, the founder of Boko Haram was a guy by the name of, excuse me, a guy by the name of Mohammed Yusuf. Mohammed Yusuf was a Tijaniya. He grew up as Tijaniya, so Sufi. He is essentially a kid of post-colonial Nigerian history. I can't quite remember exactly when he was born, but certainly he was born by the time I knew what Nigeria was. Incredibly young. I mean, I'm old enough to know the Nigeria of the late 60s and the early 1980s. Phyllis and I were talking about the Nigeria where I used to teach just down the road from where I grew up in Ibadan, where I was born and raised in Ibadan. So it's really very interesting. When I look at Mohammed Yusuf, it boggles the mind. It boggles my mind that somebody actually born in the 1970s can do so much havoc. It really boggles the mind. He's dead now. He was essentially executed by the Nigerian authority, extrajudiciary. So he started in this Salafi movement, the Salafi movement inspired by Abubakar Gumi in the 1970s and 1980s. And that movement is called Nzala. Nzala provides a Salafi critique of the predominant Islamic traditions in Nigeria on at least 2 or 3 major fronts. The first is that Sufis are not good Muslims. Sufis are not good Muslims. Despite the well-established Sufi tradition in Islam, Sufi is clearly a legitimate form of Sunni Islam because it pervades the Muslim world. Right? It pervades the Muslim world. So the ambivalence of Salafi coming out of the Gulf region against Sufi Muslims is now played out on the Nigerian socio-political scene, as one can imagine in other parts of the Muslim world. So we need to understand the ideology and doctrine of Salafi and Salafiyya. In popular language, if I can ask, what is the popular idea of Sufi? What, if it's not Salafi, what would it be? What do we call the Saudi Arabia brand of Islam? Wahhabi. Yeah, Wahhabi. Yeah, that is Salafi. They prefer actually to be called Salafi, not Wahhabi. And I always try to call people what they prefer to be called. That is really what we know. So Wahhabism is really Salafi. So we need to understand that strand of what? Of Salafi. I was almost going to say Wahhabism, of Salafiyya. Salafiyya has gained momentum around the world since the oil boom of the 1970s. Yeah, since the oil boom of the 1970s, since the rise of the Gulf states. So in a way, the Gulf elite can't have it both ways, right? On the one hand, they're perpetuating Salafism, on the one hand, as a global ideology and doctrine of Islam. And I'm not one to suggest that everything about Salafi is just really horrible and negative, as some people would like to. No, it's really a mixed bag of all kinds of possibilities, as these things. Because what is really important, if you recall what I said earlier, we don't want to just simply think about the ideology and the doctrine. We also have to ask ourselves the question, particularly in our teaching, in our curriculum, in our pedagogy, messages that don't resonate just simply don't work. People are not a bunch of what? Stupid, ignorant creatures who just take on all kinds of ideologies and they're just easily manipulated in kind of a neo-Marxist argument. That in actual fact, ideologies and doctrines that have a lasting power resonate. And they resonate not for the negative reasons that we want to believe they do. They resonate in the minds of the people who subscribe to them in the ways in which they've interpreted, translated as good for them. Good for them. Which might not be good for you and me. It's not good for me. But they've said at that particular moment, it may not be good for them tomorrow, by the way. And oftentimes it doesn't quite live up to its promise. They never do. They never do. But I think we need to get away from this idea. And it's a particular kind of predictable teleological idea that comes out of the West and its engagement with Islam. And I don't mean this West as the West and the rest. I'm saying this really as a Western kid myself. The West has shifted. I mean, in my way, when most of my Nigerian compatriots in northern Nigeria are looking north, they're looking across the Sahara to the Maghreb and they're looking east, Sudan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. So where am I looking, given the fact that I'm born and raised 70 miles out away from the Atlantic coast? So where would I be looking? Where do you think I'm looking? Where am I looking? Am I looking west? Am I looking east? Or am I looking north? I'm looking west. I'm looking west. I have to look west. I have no choice but to look west. When I get on the plane in Lagos, I'm going to only one place or two places, three places. I'm going to London. And from there I'm going to New York. And occasionally if I have to come to Montreal, to McGill, that's it for what, but it's really going to those very specific places. I have no need whatsoever to go to Saudi Arabia. I mean, there are now people who are going there as Nigerian Christians and others, or to, no, not Saudi Arabia, it's United Arab Emirates is more like it, and you know the reason why they're going, but we won't touch that. But the point is, so in a way the West here is not about a caricature of the West. It's not about race, it's about ideas. It's not about people who inhabit Western countries anymore. It's about a particular orientation. So my discourse of northern Nigeria, and most of the people that I know as Nigerians, when they talk about northern Nigerian Muslims, they talk about northern Nigerian Muslims in a more insular way than most Westerners do. They see northern Nigeria as extremely backward and reactionary. They have this highly subjective caricature of what it means to be a northern Muslim. And they always say that after all, they have their own Muslims too, and our own Muslims are good Muslims, because they just really don't do these crazy things that northern Nigerian Muslims do, like to go around. So what I'm trying to suggest is that as we engage the narrative of Boko Haram, two things we need to do. The first really is to engage it within the context of the texture of Nigerian history, first on its own terms, going back at least to the 18th century. The second thing we want to do is to look at the short history of Boko Haram. Now, I want to tell you about that short history. Now, I'm going to be very brief. The story we know about Boko Haram, that we all know about Boko Haram, is what I mentioned earlier, that this is one vicious, really horrible terrorist organization that has no limits to its ability to do harm and to indulge in the most grotesque bloodletting. And all that is true. But I think it behooves us, if we don't look at Boko Haram in terms of its own history, in the context of Nigeria, in the context of the contradictions of Nigerian state society making. And that's really what I want to submit to you, that's really what is most important. So, Muhammad Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram, this young man, Boko Haram was founded in 2002. The immediate context for the founding of Boko Haram was the massive failure of, I'm going to go through this very quickly, and so please bear with me if I don't provide context, was the massive failure of this Islamic resurgence in northern Nigeria, Islamist Resurgence I call it, coming from the prevailing Salafi alternative to Sunni Muslim rulers of northern Nigeria. So these Salafi Muslims are providing a critique on two levels against Sufi leaders of northern Nigeria. One, on a theological scriptural level, that is to say, these leaders of northern Nigeria allow too much innovation. In other words, too much of what is un-Islamic into their doctrine. They're rather permissive. They're open to all kinds of indigenous African practices. Right? And by so doing, they collaborate with all sorts of people. And by so doing, they just simply cannot possibly represent the right path, the righteous path, the pious path to Islam. Guess what? In the land of Muslims, in Dar es Salaam. And that's really very important. Northern Nigeria is not just simply about being Muslim. Northern Nigeria is intentionally the land of Muslims, as much of the Sahel is. That is just an historical fact. In large measure because Islam has been the texture of that region of the world for many, many centuries. Islam in northern Nigeria did not arrive 2 centuries ago. Northern Nigeria is part of the Sahel. The Sahel actually is part of the greater what? The greater Maghreb. It really is. Kano had a long-standing chronicle in terms of the discourses on Sharia for a long time. There's always all kinds of transactions and debates that are ongoing. Some of the most amazing literature on Islam comes out of contemporary Kano. Not even as a result of the jihad of Usman dan Fodio. So in the land of Muslims, in a self-conscious land of Muslims that is also heterogeneous, multicultural, in a Nigeria that is plural by its very nature, in which its constitution is based on English common law, you already have one major area of discontent that is undeniable, and that is what? English common law. Think about it. English common law is in their mind, is a fundamental problem, and will always be a fundamental problem. That will never go away. This is not my story. We just have to deal with that as a variable. It will not go away, no matter how much we rail against it. This is the reality. So in the land of Muslims, in a self-conscious land of Muslims, there will always be people at some point who will always say that the rules in which they govern, because it's based on what you and I believe to be a secular law, in their mind, that secular law is not secular. That law is fundamentally what?
Abomination?
What?
Abomination?
It's but why?
Unrighteous.
It's unrighteous. Why unrighteous? It's unrighteous because what is secular to me and you, as in their mind, a religious mourning. It has a religious idea. In Western modernity, and those of us shaped by the West, Western secularity has been emptied of its religious and theological traditions, obviously. But in the cognitive realities of this people, what I call secular, the moment I mention secular, which I'm suggesting as a Southern Nigerian Christian, what they're hearing from me is an ideology that is fundamentally Western and Christian. Yeah. And there's no running away from that. And I can argue from here till kingdom come. There's no way I'll convince a Salafi that secularism is neutral. It's just not going to happen. So now, not to make this really self-defeating, a kind of a paralysis of analysis. Now, what will be the alternative? The alternative, obviously, is that if we want secularism to work, it must have its own particular Nigerian African identity first. And guess what? It must work for the masses of ordinary people. In other words, cognitively, Muslims will see it as something working for them. Something meeting their needs as Muslims. Something meeting their own aspirations in terms of all the things that we all want. I mean, I was having a conversation earlier. We have conversations about our kids all the time. We want our children to do well. I think that's what we all have in common. If young people don't have a future, in a Nigerian society where the state is fundamentally predatory and essentially, neo-patrimonial, where you have this consensus among political rulers of Nigeria, whether they're Christians or Muslims, it doesn't really matter. They operate on the rents they collect from what? From oil. That's their lifeline. That's the basis of their existence. Nigeria became a major oil-producing country, as you all very well know, in the early 1970s. Nigeria is also a country of 180 million people. It's one of the most fragmented, diverse countries in the world. And what tends to happen in Nigeria is that Nigeria operates essentially a prebendal system. It's really, you operate on the beneficence of the state. The structures and the systems of Nigeria is made that way until you begin to restructure the Nigerian state in such a way that governance is not just going to be another rudimentary process of civil democratic encounters and dialogue and discussions among Nigeria's ethno-regional, ethno-religious political elites, who make tons and tons of money to the detriment of the masses of ordinary people with virtually no future, and those of them who have some future don't quite know exactly where they're going. Remember what I mentioned about Biafra, Neo-Biafra movement becomes attractive in this context. So the Neo-Biafran folks are going back to Biafra. In northern Nigeria and central Nigeria, the Muslim kids and the Muslim youths are going back to what? They're going back to the pathway provided by Neo-Salafi. Neo-Salafi now critiques not just simply Sufi, but critiques Sufi rulers as essential partners with a fundamentally corrupt Nigerian, custodians of the Nigerian state and rulers of the Nigerian state. They're part and parcel of this massive structural systemic corruption. See, the argument should not be lost to any of us. It's a very simple argument. It's not a complex argument. It's not a difficult argument. That argument resonates all the time. But there's another layer to that argument, which I think is also, quite frankly, tenable, which you also need to take very seriously, and that is to say that the West is very much, a partner in that corruption, despite the fact that the West rails against the corruption. That in a way the West is not outside of that corruption. At least that's the way it's presented to them, and that's the way it resonates with them. That in a way the Nigerian so-called comprador class must really find solace somewhere. The crude analogy that I have, and bear with me, crude analogies have their limitations, and that is, if African rulers steal money, and they do, big money, or rulers from wherever, guess what? They're smart enough to know they're not going to hide that money in Nigeria. Where do they hide that? And we know where they hide that money. And I'm convinced completely in my mind that it's not just simply the thief, it's also the recipient of the money. They're both culpable. The money is actually in Swiss banks, English banks, and American banks. And we know that money because they've been traced to those banks. And they never go back. They never go back. So that's just one very simple, as I said, it's a crude explanation. It's way more complex than that. But there's a place for crude explanation because they open us up to all kinds of other possibilities. Because in so many ways we're talking with both sides of our mouth. And we can't have it both ways. We can't, even when we want to. Right? So in a way, what we need to now do is to say, okay, in the ways in which this particular African nation state is configured, and the power calculations, we need to take that power configurations very seriously. We need to think about the ways in which the local, the national, the global are very much connected. We also have to really have an appreciation for the impact of neoliberal globalization in so many African countries. I will not argue that Africans have been wholesale losers in economic globalization. But the reality is they've been winners and losers. The argument that the West won and others lost is just not true, or some of the global South won. It's simplistic at best. But what we all have to agree upon, and the evidence is very clear on this, as empirical evidence, is that some regions in the global South lost severely. They were truly devastated. They lost not as a result of any kind of a conspiracy. They just simply don't have the tools at all to navigate and negotiate the massive disruption of economic globalization. Northern Nigeria is your classical place where that happened. Northern Nigeria, now I'm going to use this in terms of just simply gender, because I think the gender component of this is incredibly important. So, in Northern Nigeria, in Muslim Northern Nigeria I should say, because there are also minority Christians in Northern Nigeria, any form of schooling, that is to say elementary education, even in the most progressive emirate states, this is not an exaggeration, will not exceed 7%. What?
Maybe lower.
Lower. Yeah, will not exceed 7%. I want us really to think about this, because I say context matters a great deal. Will not exceed 7%. It used to be higher. The schools have been thoroughly devastated, whether Muslim schools or Western government or mission schools. They won't go to mission schools anyway, but even federal government or state government schools. I'm not even talking about secondary school, I'm talking about elementary schools. It gets even more ominous. Girls' education. And this is really where it's really, see, if there's anything we can get out of this conversation, quite frankly, in my mind, about Islamist movement, and I think Willie will missing the point, it's really about girls' education. Unfortunately, we're losing sight of a great historic moment. And if there's anything I want to employ you, to begin to do, is to engage this issue, not just simply in the context of Nigeria, because most of us are not specialists in Nigeria anyway, but in the context of whatever Muslim world you're interested in. In most northern Nigerian Muslim states, the percentage of girls having any formal education is horrifying. It really is. In most cases, it's lower than 4%. In some cases, it's not any more than 2%. Just think about that. Think about what that might mean. It means in a way that any kind of institutional space for girls to create a sense of autonomy and independence for their own well-being, and that of their own community, their own family, is completely lost. But it gets even worse. It means invariably the propensity for them to be married away. And I don't mean this to be, I don't indulge in dramatic, sensational discourses, because I think it's really not useful. But we need to really sort of engage these issues. I'm raising these issues in a particular context, not because I just want us to rail against them, but rather to understand them and explain them. So in other words, we should not run away from facts that are jarring. But what is important for us to do is to explain them and explain them seriously. So my point here is to say, okay, now, if these girls are not having formal education, and they're being married away, and these are really, please don't take my word for it, check this yourself, at the age of, literally at the age of puberty, to men who are what? Twice their what? Their age, as second, third wives. Okay? So you can imagine the kind of autonomy they will have as individuals, the kind of self-meaning they will have as individuals, and the ways in which they're going to be able to contribute to their communities. It wasn't like that before. That's my point. The critique here is not a critique that should be coming just simply from the West. Muslim women have their own critique on this subject, and that's really where we need to go. But we don't want to go there. There are a proliferation of Muslim women organizations in northern Nigeria and central Nigeria making this case all the time. But guess what? We don't want to be their allies. We just ignore them for they raise these issues. I'm not raising these issues, by the way. They are the ones, and the literature, by the way, is very clear. It's not marginal, it's extensive. They organize as we do, they meet as we do, they meet under very difficult conditions. They do. They meet in northern Nigerian cities. They form alliances with Western feminists and southern Nigerian Christians. They travel the world over. They're very apprehensive about Western feminist ideas. Not because they're ideologically opposed to Western feminist ideas, but because they know the limitations of those ideas in Muslim land. In other words, they're really very smart. They know that alien ideas just simply don't work. They're very well educated. They know that in order for them to engage a debate with conservative ulamas, conservative Muslim clerics in their neighborhood, who, by the way, are some of their uncles and fathers and so on. What do they have to do? They have to engage seriously Muslim scriptural texts. They have to read the Quran and the Hadith. And they have to lift out critically, meaningfully, chapters and verses within the traditions of Islam that says, no, you don't do that to women. No, you don't do that to foreigners. No, you don't do that to Muslims who don't think like you. No, thank you, you don't do that to people who don't look like you or behave like you. And it is there in the Hadith. It is there in the Quran. And they know those verses. And they engage those verses. But we don't want to engage those verses with them, because we've come to the realization that there's nothing progressive in those scriptural texts. In other words, we've surrendered to the conservative and reactionary ulamas by virtue of engaging in their discourse as what? As a reified discourse of Islam. And that, for me, is one of the biggest problems that we encounter here. By the way, I'm not suggesting that that's the only pathway out. What I'm suggesting otherwise, it's a very important pathway out. Because that pathway speaks very clearly and directly to the realities of these people in ways in which it doesn't speak to mine. I am not arguing, by the way, for a theological pathway. It's not my argument. As a matter of fact, I'm by my very nature completely committed to all forms of religion outside of the public sphere. So, in societies that are deeply religious, I have to find a way to enter their world, to engage their world. Not because I want to agree with them, because if I want to make any inroads. And that is what these fantastic, amazing women warriors of Islam in northern Nigeria have been doing. They've been doing it for a long time. They've been doing it since the reformism of Usman dan Fodio. They've been doing it all through the colonial period. There are so many of these heroic figures in those colonial Nigerian history. We don't know them. We don't care to know them. And they are just really fierce women warriors. They argue, fight, struggle for girls' education. Western, secular, Muslim. And I think So I think it's really very important for us to engage those kinds of, to find a way to engage those kinds of discussions. So Boko Haram, for me, Boko Haram, before Boko Haram, it was the Aitaitsini in the 1980s. Before the Aitaitsini at the turn of the 20th century in colonial Nigeria, it was the Neo-Mahdi. After Boko Haram, believe me, there'll be another one. They always come every 10 years. There are always voices of discontent. So the context really is to make sure that those voices of discontent, and they always have massive foot soldiers, too many to count. Northern Nigeria is not the backwaters, to be sure. It's one of the most sophisticated regions in all of Africa south of the Sahara. These are very, very confident people, with a very rich history. And these are people whose world has always been connected with the wider world. And whether we like it or not, if we really want to be on the right side of history, we really have to engage them. We need to really do the work. We need to do the work, and we need to do the work not in the context of what is fashionable and dominant and trendy and in vogue in the West. Not in the context of a discourse or a war on terror in a 9/11 world, but in the context of their own particular lived history and experience. Let me just show a couple, so just very quickly a couple of maps. So I want us to see, Nigerians always operate on this logic of geopolitical zones. So in this context, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zones. Some people will say there are actually 6. So you have the core northern Muslim north, which I talked about quite extensively. I mentioned it's looking north and it's looking east. There's the middle belt states, the central Nigeria, which I refer to. This used to be the land of the pagans, indigenous people who have now become Christianized, who use essentially Christianity to what? To defend themselves against what? The expansion and the intrusion of neo-jihadists moving southwards. And this is the Atlantic right here. Niger Delta is the area where you have much of Nigeria's petroleum. Nigeria is a major petroleum exporting country, as is very well known. And the lifeline of Nigeria, at least in terms of the way things are done and the ways in which you can have this elite, political elite consensus, is really on the politics, the rent collected from oil. Nigeria is a rentier state by its very nature and operates on that basis. Southwestern Nigeria dominated by the Yoruba people, which is essentially, this is as far as the jihad went. The jihad stopped about here and had conversion impact on southwestern Nigeria. So, but at the same time, you'll see that southwestern Nigeria is just also around the Atlantic. Lagos is just around here. So you have a kind of a pushback of Christian evangelization from the mid-19th century coming from the Atlantic, largely coming from Sierra Leone and coming out of the Atlantic slave abolitionist movement of the British. The British are very interested in terms of the Atlantic slave trade and Atlantic slavery, in the sense that Atlantic slavery, as we all very well know, picked significantly as a consequence of what? The actions of the British in the slave trade, right? Atlantic slave trade. But then also what? Plummeted when the British said enough is enough, pretty much at the beginning of the 19th century, the turn of the 19th century. At any rate, Sierra Leone Freetown will become that bastion of Western civilization. And that really shaped the discourse on Christian evangelization in Atlantic West Africa. I mean, certainly in southwestern Nigeria. Southeastern Nigeria, which is there too, yeah. Southeastern Nigeria is predominated by the Igbo people. That's the region of Biafra. And we now have a new Biafra movement. So you can see this geopolitical divisions. I think this is the final map. I want to end with a discussion about Sharia. Northern Nigeria Sharia states. 2000 to the present. With the exception of two states, Nasarawa, you don't actually know these names, and I believe and Yobe. No, Adamawa, sorry, and Adamawa. All northern Nigerian Muslim states, predominantly Muslim states, they also have Christian minorities, so it gets really very interesting. Declared Sharia at the turn of the 20th century. By declaring Sharia, what that meant, or what that means rather, in the context of Nigerian politics and society, is that now Islamic law will govern not just simply personal affairs, such as inheritance and marriage, which, by the way, the British had conceded to Muslim rulers in northern Nigeria a long, long time ago. But now Islamic law will govern civil and criminal law. Nigeria is fundamentally a plural secular state. It's a multi-religious confessional state and society. Now, how can you possibly have two fundamental constitutions in one country? How can you have... This is not limited Sharia, Islamic law. Limited to even that itself can be problematic, particularly for women. Because the inheritance clauses will always be to the advantage of men anyway, and boys. But now, once you move in the direction, particularly of criminal law, you know you can't have one country. That's the beginning of the end of Nigeria. Now, the critical question is, how did we get here? Not so much as what Sharia means. We always want to talk about what Sharia means and how horrific it is in a modern civilized society. Northern Nigerians were not clamoring for expanded Sharia 30 years ago. They just weren't, even 20 years ago. But they were clamoring for expanded Sharia in large measure because the alternative that ruled their lives just failed miserably. So we go back to the same point again. If what governs your life is horrific, the alternative that isn't tested, it's never tested, that you know and you can relate to, at least you can call it yours, or somebody can call it your own tradition, becomes all of a sudden very attractive. In the land of Muslim, Sharia now becomes attractive. And conservatives, ulamas, and other Muslim clerics can, as Salafi, can now insist on Islamic law to govern civil and so, and this is really I think I should stop here. I've gone way over my time. I should stop here. And now just to conclude with a couple of sentences. Now, my subject is not in any way, I won't pretend, at the center of the mission and the objective of this wonderful summer curriculum institute. But the way Charles, Michelle, and Ira and others have constructed it is really to have folks like me and Carlton have constructed it, is to have folks like me just to come in and make trouble. So whenever they invite me, I'm going to say, why? Say, you just have to come. So I'm here. So I won't pretend that what I have to say is at the center of your discussion. So what's the takeaway? What's the takeaway for you, or at least I hope the takeaway will be? Because I really feel that we cannot engage the subject of global contemporary anti-Semitism Charles and I, Charles is very much my brother. What we talk about in public, sometimes some of it in private I talk about in public. This is one of them. So I would sort of argue with him. I wouldn't win the argument, I know, but I wouldn't give up, I'll keep trying. That you can't really separate historical anti-Semitism from contemporary anti-Semitism. But that's another story, that these questions really resonate in all sorts of interesting ways. That anti-Semitism is really the first, most dominant, most lasting form of hatred. We kind of know that. That I can do my own work as an Africanist, as a historian, as somebody who is interested in transnational, globalized African worlds, in the era of globalization, without knowing some basic things about what it is that animates you as teachers and scholars. So, and I think it's also very important, really, as you all very well know, that we can really engage the subject of anti-Semitism in the contemporary world without also seriously engaging Islam. And I just want to submit to you, engage in Islam not as the enemy, not as the adversary. I don't mean to preach at you, but as a religion that is so deeply rooted, as a real world religion, that whether we like it or not, we have to find a way to dialogue with Islam. We just have to. And it's not our call, by the way. There's certain things that we cannot run away from. No matter, in a way, we just have to come to terms with that. And it's not about good Muslims and bad Muslims either. That kind of duality is way too simplistic for me. That it's about all the possibilities that is Islam. Good, bad, and everything else in between. That is the reality. That is the challenge. That is very much the challenge of Nigerians. Nigerians can't run away from this. Africans can't run away from this. And so can we. We can't escape it. I thank you very much for your attention.
So, again, Femi, thank you very much. It was riveting. I'm going to start off with a few questions and challenges. So first of all, of course, when it comes to anti-Semitism, to understand the history of anti-Semitism is crucial. But I think what ISGAP is trying to do is sort of focus on Jews that are living rather than on dead Jews, and to understand or to focus on the acceptable forms of anti-Semitism of history that we're trying to grapple with and understand and develop awareness and solutions for contemporary anti-Semitism. Engaging Islam. There's all sorts of ways of engaging Islam, but I think some things that sort of pop into my mind is that in North Africa, Berber culture, pre-Islamic culture, pre-Islamic Jewish identity, and other forms of identities are re-emerging because of people's disdain for Islamist or political Islamic notions of Islam. And not Islam, but political Islam. The same thing's happening in Iran. Pre-Islamic Persian identities sort of re-emerging, perhaps as a new opposition to the regime. So there's all sorts of ways of engaging, of reacting, of fighting back to this sort of repressive form of ideology. Call it a repressive, reactionary form of ideology. And I was also struck by several things that you said. And, you speak about structures and systems. So it's fascinating. So I want to kind of take three periods and go backwards for your comments. There's sort of this period of globalization, and actually Femi and I edited a book on globalization and marginality 20-odd years ago. So we spoke about globalization and cultural identity and the impact that neoliberalism is having on identity. And I don't think I certainly didn't understand the implications of what we were beginning to see. Fast forward 20 years, it's pretty intense and remarkable. How identities are shifting as a result of neoliberalism. It's also important, it's also interesting to me that you speak about the impact, or that you speak about the fact that the British during the colonial period kind of used Islam as a way to infiltrate and control or have influence in Nigeria, or parts of Nigeria. It's interesting in a sense. You weren't here for the open lecture, but I spoke about how, for example, funding from Islamists to Western universities in the United States, Canada, Europe, even here, Islamic studies, we spoke about how it was created by and funded by the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is the Islam that is being taught at the finest institutions in the West. And I could go on for a long time, which I won't, but there was some sort of collusion between the West and the Islamist form of Islamic identity and power in the Middle East. So it's almost like a new form of this sort of collaboration in the contemporary context that is rooted in Nigerian politics. And then there's a third system that I also find fascinating, and it's sort of the competition between Islam and Christianity in West Africa and in other parts of the world, and that these are two sort of, we call them world religions. There's other world religions.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
No, but when I say world, I mean in the Nigerian context.
I know. Okay. But these world religions, in a sense, unlike other world religions, are competing in the sense that to be included, you have to accept certain beliefs, to be at one with God. Christianity through the Gospels, Islam is the final word, and behind you is the Noahide laws, where in Judaism and other indigenous religions around Africa and the Middle East, there was this notion that everybody is created in the image of God, and there's no necessary step required to be at one with God. And I remember in 2001, I came to you, I stayed with you, and your cousin Chief was there, who's a pastor in London. And I remember.
Don't worry, Chief.
Okay, I'm sorry.
He's not here to defend himself. So,
No, but I was with the two of you for a week. I actually came for a job interview from Israel, and I stayed with you in February, March 2001. And I remember, you know, this sort of surprise that you and Chief had. I was coming from Israel and the Second Intifada, and I got a job. In the
well, I mean, no. I have to. Sorry, I don't mean to rudely interrupt. Forgive me. That I would like my arguments to be presented as my argument, and the extent to which Chief's argument is Chief's argument.
Okay, fair enough.
But he's not here to defend.
No, I'm not speaking about Chiefs. I'll speak about you. So
Speak
your surprise at my narrative coming from Israel, Jerusalem in 2001, and sort of explaining the emergence of the sort of reactionary movement that was sweeping Palestinian society, and that there wasn't going to be a solution. And I think not only you, but people in the West were a little bit surprised at my reading of the situation. So, what does this mean in terms of anti-Semitism? In a sense, if anti-Semitism begins with Jews but never ends with Jews, the plight of girls in Nigeria, the plight of women in Gaza, the plight of Yazdis in Iraq, is the complete rejection of the other, and yet there are power structures in this sort of global economy that are reinforcing these systems and processes. So you speak about engaging Muslims, it's very important. But how do we create sort of this like a progressive, inclusive, humane alternative to this? And I'm going to speak, a la Benny Morris, who's not here, into this barbarism, this barbaric reactionary movement that wants to eradicate the other, be them girls, religious minorities, people who think differently. How do we engage these processes which are very
when you suggested a pushback, I was actually expecting a real pushback. This is a very soft pushback.
Oh, you're my brother.
I was getting ready for a real pushback. This is all the book.
That's for dinner after.
Yeah, well, please, you need to sharpen your pushback. I'm just joking. Look, I really appreciate that. Those observations, I thank you very much. I should mention that Charles and I, one of the things that sustained our friendship over the last 30 years, not to give too much away to it, to the extent that I think it's safe, I don't think I exaggerate in any way, but we're really brothers in the true sense of the word. It is essentially because we've always been able to engage in some kind of intense debate on everything in many ways. But at the end of the day, we're always there for one another, we always embrace one another, we always look out for one another. We respect each other's perspective completely. And I have been enriched by his perspective over the years. Since you, that in a way, I'd mentioned I knew, because Charles kind of allowed me to be a part of the discussions and the challenges of ISGAP over the years. What he didn't tell you is that we've always had these conversations about what ISGAP is doing and what to be doing, and I think it's doing so many things right and some things that I think it can do better. So we always have those kinds of debates, and I think it's really in that context that you pose these questions. If there's any distinction between us, it's really a minor distinction, it's not a major. It's very much a distinction on the point of emphasis. That, and I don't suggest you do this, because, but for me, binaries can be limiting. Binaries can be limiting. I always want to complicate binaries, whatever the binaries might be. I like to complicate racial binaries and communal binaries, for example. I love to complicate binaries on the discourse of civilization and so-called barbarism. I like to complicate gender binaries. I like the concept of dialectical intersectionality that is truly progressive and inclusive. I also know that in so many ways, one of the things I really appreciate about what you do in ISGAP and beyond, I remember when and I was saying this over lunch, that my first encounter with Charles at St. Anthony's, I'm older than him by a couple of years, so he arrived about 3 years after. And this guy from Montreal will knock on my door every couple of days to be a part of this. It was really the years of the anti-apartheid movement. So this is another Charles now. It was very much at the center of the anti-apartheid movement in Canada. And here at Oxford, as a graduate student, it was really a leader of that movement. And some of us were actually seated on the fence, because it's really good to sit on the fence, in a way. And he pulled me into that, and I was kicking and screaming. I am the better for it. And I thank him for it. And I recall that every single time. So I do believe that as scholars, some element of activism and advocacy is required in what we do. It's not meant for everyone, right? Because we also have to bring an element of dispassion into what we do as students of our subject. We have to establish an element of distance. And I think for me, that is really what I bring into the conversation. And that's why, and I don't suggest you do this, why rigid for closed categorization kind of limit so when I was talking about Boko Haram, I understand that Boko Haram, just as an example, is really the height of barbarism. To use what is the example that I gave, it's really, nothing can be more barbaric than Boko Haram. But I also want to understand how we got to where we got with Boko Haram. That's really what I'm saying. We need to really indulge. And it's not an indulgence, it's not some kind of intellectual academic indulgence to engage in that small history of nothing else. That Boko Haram did not start as some kind of a vicious, horrible, bloodletting organization. It just simply didn't, if you see what I mean. And all we need to do is go read it when it started in 2002. This is not a defense of Boko Haram, who would defend something so horrific. But that we need to really situate Boko Haram within the larger contradictions that you've always talked about of neoliberal globalization. You've written about this quite extensively. We need to engage that. We need to put Boko Haram within the larger, deeper context of the contradictions. That's all I'm saying, of what is really the Nigerian state and its power structure and power configuration. We have to do that. That's really what I do. And for me, it's extremely important to encourage people to think about and to see how things that can start badly can become horrific one day. They just don't start as horrific things. They do have a genesis. And it is not indulgent to look at that genesis
as some kind of, or to pretend they're no more than just simply a prelude. They're not. They're part of the analysis, an integral part of it. I stand by that argument completely. I stand by that argument completely because I believe in that government, because for me, the kind of the type of cross-disciplinary work that I do requires that kind of pedagogy and that type of writing. So there's no fundamental difference between us in that regard. I am thinking here more in conceptual terms, in methodological terms. I'm trying to see what might work for me as a teacher, and what my students, and I think within the context of this wonderful group, my students are asking me all the time to explain stuff to them. They're not going to become African historians, and they're not going to be specialists in African political science, in African political studies, no matter how hard I try. But whatever they are, whether they're in a local community college or at Harvard, they're really very intelligent people who I have to find a way to let them understand that what I'm saying to them does make some sense on their own terms. Do you see the point? And until we begin to encourage a curriculum and a pedagogy that will bring scholarship and research together to engage in that kind of discussion, then we're really I think we're really in a very difficult place. Let me just sort of end with one statement. Over the break, I was having a conversation with three of our colleagues who I've acquired them as my very good friends, even if they don't know that. They're to my right, not ideologically to my right, of course, but we have this really wonderful 10-15 minutes of conversation. A couple of things actually stood out in that conversation that I really appreciate. And one is that, remind me, laser sight. That's so, and I'm going to say this in a very non-elegant way. It's almost as though, yeah, okay, we get this, but really, what is the kind of an end game to all of this stuff? We didn't quite put it that way, but that's the essence of it. And guess what? Sometimes there's no clear end game and no clear pathway. Some problems really defy simple, straightforward solution, but we have to try. And all I do is I love being a teacher. I really do. I really do. I love talking to my students. And if I'm writing, I'm writing with such intentionality for them to understand what it is I'm writing, whether they're PhD students or first-year undergraduates. So, and for me, it's always very important to think less of people who agree with me, but really to think more of people who are likely to find what I have to say as objectionable. I think I have that responsibility. Not in all cases, to be sure. I have to find a way to engage them in a debate or a discussion of some type. So when I was writing this book, and this is the answer that I give Lisa, that I had in my head all the time, conservative northern Nigerian Muslim clerics, because I want them to read this book. I don't want them to dismiss this book, a book that I lived with for 10 years, off and on. I don't want them to dismiss it as another propaganda by a southern Nigerian Anglican kid. I just don't want them, who already has an axe to grind. Do you see the point I'm trying to? They may not even read or take it seriously. So for me, because I really don't believe in any way, because I know some of these individuals, I really don't believe in this logic, not you, where people are sealed off that Islam is a particular way. It's a great world religion. It really is. It's a great world religion by any measure, by any conventional measure. We may have some serious theological divisions and disagreements and all of that. And even if it's not a great world religion, which it is, I have to find a way to engage it in a real way.
that's really what I struggle to do, and I don't always, oftentimes I never get it right, but I shall continue. Yes.
Femi, thank you. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, every time I hear you, I just experience all these knockout punches and floating like butterflies. So I have to stop myself from saying, the champ is here. So thank you. Just a couple of quick things. I really appreciated your focus. You're kind of guiding us to the idea of women and girls in northern Nigeria and in the Muslim world. And it made me think about so many things that I've been thinking about. And that I've been doing some research for myself. The notion of like looking, understanding critiques of feminism and womanism, right? Which is a beautiful African American women's critique of traditional white Western middle class feminism, right? Great books like this, Bridge Called My Back, and all of that. But also the focus on the girl set, right? That you nurture a girl and a woman, and you nurture culture in the world for many, many reasons, right? And there's great literature and data around that. So there are all these multi-layered pieces that you hit upon just by drawing attention to that piece. So I wanted to thank you for that. And I'm going to get to the root of my question in just a second, and I know a lot of people will want to respond, so just bear with me 1 more second. When I was at I loved also the conversation when you and Charles began, because it took me back to my first day talking about pedagogy. My first day as a professor at Columbia, I was teaching. For every year that I taught there, I taught, as a few of the guys here, there are a few other Columbia College students. We had that core curriculum, which was brought after World War II, to help you to defend Western civilization, right? In fact, it was called Contemporary Western Civilization. The students called it From Plato to Nato. And in that course, the very first day of class, I told the students, they force you to take this class. It's 1 of 4 required courses. You must take this class in order to graduate from Columbia. And so the first essay I gave them was civilization and barbarism. What is it? Because they're telling you it's civilization, and many could argue that one man's barbarism is another man's civilization, and vice versa. In terms of particularly thinking of all the barbaric aspects of Western history and hegemony. So I say all of that to say thank you, and there's a lot more I'll take up with you at the pub. But
the time's usually better at the pub anyway.
Yeah, and I'll buy it. I got you.
Thank you.
So
I'll come.
And the last piece is that so you can hit quickly on that Phyllis Wheatley piece, which is 2 pages back. If you could dialogue with that in terms of what you're saying.
Okay, so thanks very much, Carlton. Like Charles, Carlton and I, we're really the 3 4 musketeers. We always sort of engage these, and it's always there. And thanks very much. Let me just as an addendum to the girls, young women's thing I mentioned, because when my students complain about this, by the way, I never really complete one thought process, and you must have picked this up before I jump to another one. So it's really a bunch of convoluted ideas that's running around. I've been working on that for a long time. It ain't working. One addendum I want to add to that, the reason why I brought that issue up, because it really matters a great deal to me, and I think it should matter to us. And if there's a challenge, since I have the prerogative of which you'll allow me, is really to think about this subject within the context of this particular discussion, because it's really very important. It's really the subject that is lost. And it's the most important subject, for the reasons that Carlton mentioned. And by the way, it's not difficult to fix. And the reason why it's not difficult to fix is because we have soldiers on the ground who want us to fix it. And it's not going to be a Western hegemonic imposition either. We're just simply aren't engaging it, because it's not, unfortunately, in our interest to engage it. It's convenient for us to point at it when we see the horrific impacts of it and to move on.
but engage it we must if we really want change. And the reason why I raised, I won't pretend to be a scholar, a student of this subject, but one thing is really very important, comparative perspective, that I was trying to arrive at, and I missed it entirely. When you draw comparisons between core Muslim northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria, in terms of the numbers I gave you at the level of education, it is alarming. It's night and day. It's two completely different countries. How about that? In southern Nigeria, the number exceeds 30% of girls' education, same country. As a matter of fact, in Muslim, guess what? In Muslim southern and southwestern Nigeria, it goes up to about 28% to 30%. So that's the variable, and that's the comparative index. It's not the West, thank you. Same country. Southern Nigeria, if I can say so, not because I'm from there, is one of the places where, as some of you know, some of the most amazing things are happening in the era of globalization. You know it very well. Some of the most amazing popular culture the world has ever seen is coming out of southern Nigeria. It's called Nollywood. If you haven't paid attention to, you better be paying attention to. It's the third, if not the second largest film industry in the entire world. And it's inspired, next to Nollywood, number 2. Talk about human imagination, creativity by ordinary people every single day, creating jobs for men and women, in which the binary between girls and women is just really, it's there, but it's not in any way a serious divide. I won't pretend that patriarchy is not in southern Nigeria. Same country. Same country, same world religion in operation. So just consider that for a moment. So to respond to this, this is really one of those when Carlton called this to my attention. Phyllis Whitley, for those of you who don't know, the great African-American poet, one of the greatest of her time, as a matter of fact, one of the greatest in the Western world, who wrote some amazing poetry and had the company of some of the leaders of the Western world, including English royalty, and just wrote beautifully. But this is really a particular rendition of her perspective. And it's a perspective that is way too common for, not just simply for her time, but even for my time. Folks wouldn't just simply write it this way. And that is really in Africa, and as a student in Africa diaspora studies, it's very much an Africa that is presented as an Africa of barbarism and backwardness and primitivism and on and on and on. It has a particular kind of, not Orientalist, and these kinds of ideologies, even by great thinkers and writers and poets, is really very common. So Whitley is not this writing is not uncommon. Actually, many of the slave narratives, with few exceptions, think along these lines, even as late as the mid to late 19th century. So how does one engage this, but just really to engage this in the context of the West as the savior, right? And Christianity as the solution. And the West and Christianity are synonymous. I will be a bit personal here and say, and I have no problem even in public admitting that I was born and raised a Protestant. I remember very much a Yoruba Christian. That's how I define myself. I like to see myself as, quote, small p progressive Christian. And by that I mean a Christian that is open to all religions and no religions at all. That is my own, that is where it begins and where it ends. Open to religions, all kinds of religions, provided they're decent and constructive and meaningful. So my faith is important to me. it's really part of, and I say this in part because faith is really important to most people who are born and raised in African context, or African American, African diaspora context. So for me, religion is not a problem. It's very much the ways in which, whether it's Christianity or Islam or other religions, it's the ways in which we use religion as instruments and tools and so on. So Whitley is, remember, Christian, Negro, Black, as chain, maybe farm, join, angelic, train. Whitley is writing in the narrative of both, and this is really quite sophisticated to be put. I mean, in a way that the West is really about the solution, but the West is also the West is really about the solution, and the West by its very nature is about liberation. And the pathway to liberation has to be a particular Christian Western pathway. I think it's reasonable to say that that kind of thinking is so problematic in the African American context, even then. So anyway, we can pick this up over.
Okay. Professor, you stressed very much the point that Boko Haram is more barbaric than other terrorist groups in the world. Can you give me examples for it, please?
Thank you. Femi will, just call me Femi.
Yeah, thank you.
It's because I'll call you Michael.
Thank you.
If you don't mind. So Femi will do. So I also joke around and say my father's the professor. that in a way, it's actually not a book, just anyway. So Boko Haram, I really like that question because it does provide, I hope it will provide me an opportunity to clarify what I said earlier. So I thank you very much. Boko Haram, in terms of what it has done from 2009 to about 2014, in terms of just an empirical fact, in terms of the kind of carnage, the brutality, the extent of the brutality. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. I don't want to sort of just throw things out there.
This was my question, examples.
Yeah, examples. I consider this, for instance. The examples that we all know very well is April 2014, right? The Chibok girls, a remote part of southeastern Nigeria, Borno. When those girls, 217 of them, were abducted and disappeared. That is when Boko Haram became a household global name, particularly in the West. Prior to that, most of us had never heard of Boko Haram. Few of us, but most people just never cared. But Boko Haram has actually been abducting boys and girls for a long time before then. And, by the way, continued after those girls, in large numbers. So abduction of children, for me, is a very serious matter as a father. Just to think about that, what that will do to parents of people who are particularly vulnerable. And Boko Haram did that systematically from 2009, when Mohammed Yusuf was executed by the Nigerian authorities, to about 2015. Boko Haram was not a lethal, vicious organization prior to that. Boko Haram initially was creating all kinds of civic, spaces for discontented men in southeastern Nigeria. Do you see the point? So in a way, it was essentially an haven for people who felt left out. I mean, yeah, they indulged in some kind of petty criminality. So I think we need to really sort of understand the first phase of Boko Haram. In 2009, the Nigerian authorities, when they unleashed their power against Boko Haram, over 1,000 young people were killed, over 1,000 in 2 days. Literally executed by the Nigerian authorities. And that ought to be a part of the discourse. Just simply an allegation of being followers of of Mohammed Yusuf. Do you see the point I'm trying to? So in a way, this is not in any way a rationalization for Boko Haram. We need to understand this. That the notion of jihad here, right, now resonate in terms of a reaction against the onslaught of the Nigerian authorities. I'm not arguing for it, I'm just saying. So, so we need to understand the second phase of Boko Haram. And that second phase is really that extreme behavior, abduction of children, literally attacking local communities in areas where the Nigerian authorities have no influence. By the way, it's really very important to appreciate that most African states really have no control over their territories, particularly remote regions of their country. They just don't, and they will never do, no matter how hard we try, not anytime soon. They may have control over major urban areas, towns and cities, but there's no policing, there's no civic engagement. The notion of state capacity is clear in the political science of most global south countries, particularly Africa. So the capacity to engage, so what is essentially is that the followers of Boko Haram, as indeed most other militant Islamist organizations, they know the terrain very well, in ways in which you and I will never know that terrain. Sambisa forest that we read about all the time, because Mohammed Yusuf has been preaching. One of the things, itinerary preachers in Sahelian societies get up one day, and you just see them, they go from one town to another preaching, so the people know them all over, if you see what I mean. So they know these spaces that Nigerian authorities just simply cannot know. Do you see the point? So in a way, but then when you now begin to have situations of suicide bombers, a kind of a misnomer, suicide bombers, that's really what we call them, and they're mostly girls, and they're underage. They're not suicide bombers, because suicide what? Connotes that you know what you're doing. So we have to really sort of deconstruct our own language in ways in which we don't want to. These are abducted children, for crying out loud. And it's not sufficient just simply to say they've been brainwashed. If you see what I mean, some of them are carrying these lethal weapons in their bodies, and they just don't even know when it's going to decimate. So there are, if we really want to moralize and engage in ethical questions, we better make sure we do it right. We cannot pick and choose the ones we like and how we want to moralize. That's my point. So yeah, these questions are really grotesque, they're difficult, they're challenging, they're jarring. I guess the point I'm trying, this is really why I mentioned, Michael, that I don't want to just give a litany of cases and cases and cases, but rather for us to have some understanding of the ways in which we analyze these very difficult questions. My own solution, as a theoretical solution, quite frankly, is really to build up society, build up and invest in society. Invest in essential goods and services. That is not going to be easy. Build up the capacity of the state in such a way that, invest in moral authority and political legitimacy. That people know that their rulers, their leaders, will be answerable to them. Anyway, just saying.
The second question, very short. Before the questions, you finish your talk saying about the possibility of dialogue with the Muslim world. There is I don't want to explain the concept, but the sociological concept of critical mass. From 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, it's almost 25% of terrorists considered now. They already achieved the critical mass number. Do you think that there is now a possibility of dialogue with them?
Well, let me, before I answer your question, the other possibility is this is really, Michael, you'll forgive me for saying this, and I say this in French. And when you say you're going to say something in French, it's going to come out the wrong way. At the end of the day, what alternative do we have? Not to dialogue with them? Look, at the end of the day, you said it's not just simply...
I can't answer that.
No, I know. That's why I want to filibuster your answer, because I know you're tempted to say. So in a way, what I just want to say very quickly to that is that let's assume your figures are correct. And you know how these things are about polling and the ways in which we poll. And I know this few polls. I approach them with a big, massive grain of salt. But be that as it may. I'm not an apologist for any of this stuff. I'm just saying that, for me, dialogue is inevitable. Right? It's just inevitable. Dialogue is just simple common sense. It's just simple common sense. Dialogue is who we dialogue with is another. We can have that conversation. How we manage that dialogue.
Let's have dinner.
What?
Let's have dinner today.
Okay, so just to interrupt, we're at the time, but we'll extend it for 10 minutes. And Stephanie and Navros, we'll collect 2 quick questions.
You want to go first? Okay, I'm going to be brief because I want to respect time. I have a comment and a question, and I'm going to, it's hard for me to keep it brief because you said so many things that were inspiring to me. First, thank you for your talk, thank you for the concepts raised, the context that you gave us. You ended by saying that you weren't sure if there was a connection to what we're talking about in ISGAP and what you shared. I see an extensive number of connections, so I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you for raising the plight of women and young girls and the autonomy and life expectancy that has changed when we educate girls. I'm just glad that you say that out loud. It's wonderful. And we can talk later about why. But what I really wanted to get back to is pedagogy. When you started, you began by talking about the way that you work with your students, the way you teach them and the way you learn from them. In the academy, that approach is rare. So much is lecture, and so much is not honoring. You've already said you love teaching, your students are brilliant. What I'd like to ask you to do is share, very short, because we only have 10 minutes. Why do you do that? Like, what is your intent? Because pedagogy and delivery is all about intention. So why do you approach learning that way when you could just be like everyone else who doesn't?
I mean, thanks very much for those really very kind, really generous comments. I'm very grateful. I really don't think it's deserving, but I'll take them. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, in terms of pedagogy and a particular kind of intention that I stumbled on by sheer accident, I always say that that there's really something about being in the margins. I love being in the margins of everything, and I think immigrants are by their very nature in the margins. There's a real distinction between being marginalized, being in the margins and being marginalized or marginality. People who are in the margins actually see better than people in the core. And I understand this in terms, I come from a world in Ibadan that Phyllis knows very well, where I am at the center of all the discussion in terms of power dynamics. And it wasn't really until I got to this country, the United States, now this country, that I became really in the margins. So it's really funny when it's split that way psychologically. As to put it very bluntly, in a society where race matters a great deal, and being a black person matters even more, quite frankly. So for me, I was able to bring those kinds of questions almost intuitively into the ways in which I engage my work in American society, and even my colleagues in my teaching. So experimentation is part of being in the margins. Marginalized people, marginal people, well, not marginal, they tend to operate that way. So what a lot of my colleagues, quite frankly, cannot see. I hate to say it sounds really arrogant. I can see it. So when they're complaining, and then tell my colleagues at Stony Brook I said, don't tell anybody I said it. Because you still know those guys and I love them dearly. When they're complaining, when I started as an academic at Stony Brook, I never understood why they're complaining. Right? I say, just the resources are not enough, the libraries are not good enough, the classes are way too big, there's too many students. They say, so what's going on with these guys? In part because the alternative for me would have been to be in Ibadan. That's the way my parents wrote the script to be at the University of Ibadan. University of Ibadan, the premier university, one of the best in Africa by then. By the time I became an academic in 1990, it already gone down. So I can, in that way, as an immigrant, I can have that kind of perspective. So how does all this connect with pedagogy? It's really about experimentation without knowing you experiment. If you're in the margins, you're not doing things the way other people are doing it. And I kind of like that. When my colleagues are talking about a particular formula of how you teach, I listen to them, and I'm always just really skeptical about what they're saying, quite frankly. It just makes sense to them, but it doesn't always make sense to me. Do you see what I mean? And that's fine, and they're really my very good friends. So in a way, when I arrived at Bowdoin, the first thing, to answer your question more directly, is now I'm in this most selective, highly selective, whichever way you want to describe it, liberal arts, National Liberal Arts College, where resources are really in abundance. In those kinds of places, there are really more resources for teachers and scholars than Harvard and Yale and Princeton put. Seriously, they spend money on those kids. They really spoil them, those top 20 liberal arts. So you have money to do everything. Talk about embarrassment of riches. You want to do a curriculum, and you just write 2 pages, and somebody will give you $10,000 to go do it, without even reading the thing thoroughly. I mean, seriously, I'm not making this up. If you say, for instance, I mean, there's at Amherst College where I'm going, there's a paid leave every 3 years. Who does that kind of stuff? Do you see the point? So my point is, in that context, I'm able now to construct my pedagogy around my students in a loose way. I'm saying, I have these intensely, for the first time, short of really talking to undergraduates at Oxford, who are in another world, because there's a pub in every college. Anyway, who are in another world, who are incredibly gifted and incredibly intensely bright. So I have these kids, these young people, and they're from everywhere around the country and all around the world. And they're very conscientious. And somebody's telling me that they'll pay for them as my researchers over the summer. I'm not going to pay for them. I know how well the top 20% of these kids write. They write better, I'm not kidding, than most PhDs and professors do. They do. The top 10, 15% of these kids. They've come from, in a way, and it tells you something about when you have resources to be really highly selective. Now, if I can have that 19, 20-year-old excited about my work, running around with me, with me for 3 months, investing in my work, I sounds really self-serving. Why not?
One quick question.
Thanks for your lecture. I've been wondering, where do the madrasas in Nigeria draw their curriculum from? I'm aware of the fact that on the other coast of Africa, in Tanzania, there are a number of madrasas that follow the curriculum prescribed by Nadwatul Ulama and Darul Ulum in India. The other question is that do the pastors in Nigeria ever indulge in any anti-Semitic rhetoric during the services? And if they do, how would you compare that with the anti-Semitic rhetoric in the Muslim discourse there?
In 40 seconds.
I mean, even if it's 40 minutes, right? It's a very tough crowd. No, I don't mean it that way. But it's a good question. I just don't have the qualifications to answer them. I'm going to try. He did mention, he gave me an opening in 40 seconds. Okay, so
Over.
So the second part of your question is actually quite easy, and that is the anti-Semitism that is woven into their discourse. I think one can look at that in a number of ways. Let me just mention to you that there's a tendency, most radical Islamicists in Africa, at least in Nigeria where I study, I certainly won't in the Sahel, in Mali, in Chad. They do have a vision of the world, but they have a preoccupation with things very local. So they, 95% of their discussion, quite frankly, is about their own internal realities. And really, I mean, we can't run away from that, if you see what I mean. Because they're really not as sophisticated as we make them to be. I am not suggesting they're not engaged in the wider world, they are. So even when they engage with really backward language of hatred, which is there, it's sporadic and horrific. And I'm not saying it can't do damage, it can. Do you see the point? But it's not really what animates them. Do you see what I mean? It's not but because that just simply won't resonate among the kids they're trying to capture. Do you see what I mean? So yes, there are anti-Semitic utterances and ideas. And I think I agree with you, or what you imply. We need to understand that, engage it, think about it, reflect upon it. But we also have to think about the 95 other things that they're talking about, which is really very local, about the ways in which they live in their own communities, their own societies. About the ways in which their kids have no food, no shelter, no access to anything. Do you see the point? You know, and the ways in which they see corruption all around them. So, so I think it's really a matter of balance. It's really what I'm trying to encourage us to do, to think about this balance between what is important to us outside and what is important to them on the inside. So what I want to encourage in our conversation is that what is our own preoccupation is not necessarily what is going on in all these other places, no matter how hard we try. On the question of madrasas, I mean, in the case of northern Nigeria as a Sahelian society is really about itinerary Muslim preachers. It's been for centuries. I can't wish that away, even if I want to. But what we do know, though, which is very important, is that these itinerary preachers become less and less significant. Guess what? When there are schools forward by the state, we know their numbers are not always high all the time. There's nothing intrinsically essential about them, except if we want to indulge in narrow essentialism, and I don't do that. We know their number fluctuates over time, and we have to ask ourselves the question, why does the number fluctuate? And my view is that the alternative is oftentimes what isn't there. If there are no formal institutions of schooling, what I mentioned about girls, there are no madrasas in southwestern Nigeria. Southwestern Nigeria is one of the largest cultural zones in all of Africa south of the Sahara. Yorubas are roughly about 30 million people. Half of Yorubas are Muslims. Do you see what I mean? But there are no traditions. Do you see the point? So, I mean, and I know that the tradition of so what is really very important is for us to appreciate first the context in which religion is made manifest in local societies. Thank you very much for that.
So, Femi, on behalf of everybody, really thank you very much for riveting and profound, I need to say, presentation. As the chair, I want to leave you with a thought for the evening as you go out for dinner. And I think I want to challenge you as scholars. I arrived here from Israel, and if you go to the north of Israel, there's a steady flow of ambulances that come from Syria into hospitals in northern Israel. They don't go with, there's no sirens. There is Hebrew writing on and Arabic writing. There are ambulances coming from Syria, the Golan Heights, into hospitals in Israel. No sirens, but a steady flow of people coming who are been wounded in the, I'm using the term genocide, although it's controversial, some people don't agree with the term. So the neighborhood is having a genocide. As Femi said, scholars, perhaps our primary raison d'etre, the reason what we do, is to ask why, to understand societies and why things are happening. But there is a point, I would argue, and maybe this is a point of a conversation, in addition to trying to understand why, I would argue that there's a profound obligation, a moral obligation as intellectuals who have the time and the space to discuss these issues, to also ask the question of what do we do? So not only why, but what do we do? And in the words of Emmanuel Levinas, he argued, based on the Talmud, the Pirkei Avot, and the laws that Akiva was talking about on Sunday, is that on the one hand, we're all created in the image of God, and he argued that the moment you see your face and the face of the other, that's the instant you become human. The moment you see your face and the face of the other is the instant you become human. At the same time, when there's ideologies that deny the humanity of groups of people, who call certain groups of people the causes of all the ills in the world, that certain groups of people emanate from the urine of donkeys and of apes and pigs, when we are so dehumanized, Levinas would argue that there is no God, that we are called to respond in certain ways. And what the answers are, to be honest and to be a little bit humble, I don't know. But these are questions that I think we really need to ask ourselves, because we are facing, and I will reiterate it to the discomfort of Femi and others, many people here perhaps, that this is a barbaric reactionary social movement that is out to liquidate people. The question is, what do we do? I don't have the answer, but this is perhaps the question.
I want to let you out the last.
At dinner.
No. Just one sentence, one quick sentence. I do agree that barbarism is something we need to confront. I'm in complete agreement with you. What I'm suggesting, though, is for us to understand the nature of the barbarism.
So what I'm suggesting, no, this is very important. I agree with you. It's profoundly important. What I also suggest is that when people are coming to exterminate me because my group and other groups are the descendants of apes and pigs and the solution is to exterminate, at some point my first question can't be why, because it may be too late. It has to be what to do. And you know that one.
To be continued.
Thank you.